My sister stole my fiancé, showed up at my wedding in white, and got exposed in the most epic way, and then my earliest memories always seem to carry the faint sting of comparison, like a shadow trailing behind me. It wasn't something I could escape, not in our home. My younger sister, Claire, was 6 when she became the undeniable star of our family. She was the one who could command attention effortlessly, her golden hair catching the light as she twirled in the middle of our modest living room. I was 8 then, and my world was completely different from hers. I spent my time taking apart clocks, carefully examining their inner workings on the worn wooden desk in my room. The soft tick-tock of the gears felt like a language I understood deeply. My bookshelves were crowded with volumes on the solar system, mechanics, and anything that promised to teach me how things worked. But no one else seemed to notice the small world I was creating for myself. Instead, I often heard my mother, Patricia, downstairs, her voice carrying up the stairs as clearly as if she were standing next to me. "Why can't you be more outgoing like your sister?" she would ask my father, Robert. Claire's gift was social grace. Even as a child, she was able to make our parents' friends laugh, performing little routines she'd seen on TV or creating her own dramatic renditions of fairy tales. She had a way of making everyone feel like they were part of her spotlight. I admired her for that in a distant way, but I knew I was nothing like her. One evening, I sat at the dinner table, excited to share something I had learned about the constellations. I'd spent the afternoon reading about Orion's belt and how it connected to a larger star cluster. "Did you know that some of the stars in Orion are thousands of times larger than our sun?" I said, hoping to spark even a flicker of interest. "That's nice, Maggie," my mom replied absent-mindedly, already turning to Claire. "Claire, darling, tell us about what you did at your dance class today." Claire launched into an animated story about learning a new routine, complete with gestures and sound effects. My father chuckled at her antics, and my mother beamed with pride. My attempt to share something meaningful dissolved into the background, unnoticed. When I turned 10, I asked for a chemistry set for my birthday. I'd seen one in the window of a small hobby shop downtown and dreamed about all the experiments I could try. But when my birthday arrived, I was handed a stack of used books instead. My mom smiled as she placed them in front of me. "Books are more practical," she said, patting my shoulder. 2 months later, Claire mentioned she wanted to take ballet lessons after seeing a movie about a famous dancer. To my surprise, my parents found the money for private lessons, complete with custom tutus and gleaming new ballet slippers. The disparity wasn't something I could articulate at the time, but it etched itself into my memory. When I asked to join the school science club that same year, my mother groaned about the expense. "Why don't you focus on making some friends instead?" she said with a sigh. The one place I felt truly seen during those years was at my grandmother Eleanor's house. She lived just a few blocks away, in a cozy home that smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Grandma Eleanor had been a high school science teacher before she retired, and she understood my curiosity in a way my parents didn't. "Your mind is a gift, Margaret," she told me one afternoon as we stood in her small backyard. She pointed out the constellations to me, her voice full of wonder as she explained how ancient civilizations used the stars to navigate. Her kitchen became my first laboratory. We conducted simple experiments together, mixing baking soda and vinegar to watch the fizzing reaction, or layering different liquids in a glass to learn about density. She always treated my questions with seriousness, as if I were already a budding scientist. Eleanor's house became my sanctuary. On weekends, while my parents took Claire to her acting classes or dance recitals, I would escape to my grandmother's house. She would greet me at the door with a warm hug and an invitation to sit at her kitchen table, where we would plan our next experiment or discuss the latest science book she had picked up for me at the library. Those moments with her were a lifeline. They reminded me that my interests weren't strange or unworthy of attention. They were valuable. But as much as I treasured my time with her, it didn't erase the feelings of invisibility I carried at home. Claire's achievements, no matter how small, were celebrated with enthusiasm. When she was cast as a tree in a local community play, my parents threw a party for her, inviting neighbors and friends. There was cake, decorations, and even a photographer to capture the moment. By contrast, when I won my first science fair at school, my parents were too busy to attend the ceremony. Claire had an audition that day, and they couldn't miss it. "We're so proud of you, Maggie," my mom said later, almost as an afterthought. But Claire's audition was very important. I learned early on not to expect much acknowledgement. My love for science became a private joy, something I pursued quietly and without the need for external validation. But even then, I couldn't help but wonder what it might feel like to have someone cheer for me the way they cheered for Claire. That yearning for recognition stayed with me, growing quietly in the corners of my heart, even as I convinced myself I didn't need it. For years, I told myself I would prove my worth through my work, that someday they would have no choice but to see me. What I didn't realize then was how long that journey would be, or how much it would cost me to get there. High school marked the beginning of a new chapter in our family dynamic, though the story remained the same. Claire's spotlight only grew brighter, while my accomplishments stayed in the shadows. By then, I had learned not to expect much attention for anything I did, but that didn't make the sting of being overlooked any less painful. At 14, I poured my heart into a renewable energy project for the Illinois State Science Fair. I spent months in the school lab after hours, experimenting with ways to harness wind and solar power more efficiently. When I won first place, I felt a surge of pride I hadn't experienced before. It wasn't just about the trophy. It was about proving to myself that I could achieve something meaningful. But the night of the awards ceremony, I stood alone on the stage, scanning the crowd for my parents. They had promised to come, but I knew better than to hope too much. Later, I found out they'd taken Claire to a last-minute audition for a regional commercial. "Margaret, you know how important these auditions are for her future," my mother said when I confronted her. I wanted to ask, "What about my future?" But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded and excused myself to my room. 2 weeks later, they threw Claire a party to celebrate her casting in the commercial. It was a small role, just a few seconds on screen, but my parents acted like she'd landed a starring part in a blockbuster film. There were balloons, streamers, and a cake with "Our Star Claire" written in bold frosting. A photographer was hired to capture the moment, and relatives flew in from neighboring states to join the celebration. I stood in the corner during the party, watching as Claire basked in their adoration. My science fair trophy sat on a shelf in my room, collecting dust. High school was a whirlwind of responsibilities for me. I excelled in every subject, maintained a perfect GPA, and became the president of the science club. I joined the school newspaper, eventually becoming its editor, and spent my weekends volunteering at the local library. My calendar was full. My achievements were stacking up, but none of it seemed to matter at home. Dinner conversations revolved around Claire's theater performances, her social life, or her plans for the weekend. If my accomplishments were mentioned at all, they were brushed aside with a perfunctory "That's nice, Maggie," before the topic turned back to Claire. One evening, my mother sat me down for what she called a serious talk. For a moment, I thought she might finally acknowledge my hard work. Instead, she leaned forward, her expression serious. "Margaret, I'm worried about you," she said. "You're so focused on school and your little projects. You should spend more time making friends. Maybe go to a party or two. Claire has so many friends, and it's good for her." "I like what I'm doing," I replied carefully. "And I have friends." "Not like Claire does," she said with a sigh. "It's important to be well-rounded. You don't want to miss out on life." I didn't argue. I knew it wouldn't make a difference. When it came time to apply for college, I was determined to aim high. I had spent years building a resume that could get me into the best schools in the country, and my efforts paid off. Acceptance letters began arriving in waves, each one affirming my belief that I was on the right path. I was thrilled when I received a full scholarship to study biochemistry at a prestigious university. The relief of knowing I wouldn't have to rely on my parents for tuition was immeasurable. But my achievement was quickly overshadowed when Claire announced she wanted to attend a private performing arts college in New York. The tuition was exorbitant, far beyond what my parents could afford. Still, they were determined to make it happen. They sold our family's small vacation cabin, a place we had spent countless summers together, to pay for her education. When I expressed my disbelief, my mother's response was almost dismissive. "At least we don't have to worry about your tuition," she said. "Claire shows so much promise. We can't let her talent go to waste." Those words stayed with me, an echo that refused to fade. In college, I threw myself into my studies. The labs became my sanctuary, a place where my hard work was recognized and valued. My professors noticed my dedication and encouraged my research, becoming the mentors I had always wished for. They saw potential in me that my own parents had never acknowledged. By the time I graduated with honors, I had secured funding to pursue a PhD at a top-tier institution. It was a rare accomplishment, but the moment was bittersweet. My parents attended the ceremony but left early to take Claire to a callback for a commercial. "You should be proud of your sister," my mother said when I expressed my disappointment. "She's working so hard to make her dreams come true." I wanted to scream that I was working hard, too, that my dreams mattered just as much, but I held my tongue. Over the next few years, I built a career I could be proud of. I published widely, secured research grants, and earned recognition within the scientific community. By the time I was 30, I had established myself as a leading researcher in molecular biology. But at family gatherings, the conversation always circled back to Claire. Her acting career never quite took off, but she managed to stay in the spotlight with small roles in commercials and local theater productions. My parents treated each audition as though it were an Academy Award nomination, celebrating every minor success with the same fervor they had shown when we were kids. "Margaret is still doing her science things," my mother would say when relatives asked about me. That was the extent of my acknowledgement. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need their approval to validate my achievements. But deep down, I couldn't help but feel the weight of their indifference. Even as I climbed higher in my field, even as my work began to make waves in the scientific community, I remained the overlooked daughter in my own family. The divide between us wasn't just growing. It had become a chasm, one I wasn't sure could ever be bridged. By the time I reached my early 30s, I thought I had finally carved out a life that felt solid, one built on my own terms. My career was thriving. I had a string of publications under my name, had secured multiple grants, and was well on my way to earning tenure at the university where I worked. I'd even started mentoring younger scientists, something I found incredibly fulfilling. But while my professional life flourished, my personal life still felt like uncharted territory. That's when Philip entered the picture. Philip was a fellow researcher at the university. He was charismatic, with a sharp wit and a passion for science that matched my own. We met during a departmental meeting, and our connection was instant. It felt like, for the first time, I had found someone who truly understood me. Our relationship grew naturally, blossoming out of late nights in the lab and long conversations about the future of molecular biology. Philip seemed to genuinely appreciate my intellect and drive, and for a while, I let myself believe that I had finally found a partner who saw me for who I was. When Philip proposed, it felt like a rare moment of triumph, a milestone I had longed for but never expected. My parents' reaction, however, was lukewarm at best. "That's nice, Margaret," my mother said when I called to share the news. "But did you hear? Claire just landed a role in a regional ad campaign. She has 3 lines." I hung up the phone feeling deflated, but I tried to brush it off. I told myself it didn't matter, that this was my life and I didn't need their validation to be happy. For a time, things seemed perfect. Philip and I worked well together, not just as colleagues but as partners. He was charming and attentive, and I found myself imagining a future where we built something meaningful, both personally and professionally. That illusion came crashing down one evening when I walked into his office unannounced. I had stayed late at the lab to finish some data analysis for one of our joint projects and decided to drop off the results in person. What I found stopped me cold. There was Claire, perched on Philip's desk, her hand resting on his shoulder as they shared a kiss that was far too intimate to be explained away. My stomach dropped, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Margaret, wait," Philip stammered when he noticed me. Claire turned, her expression a mix of guilt and defiance. "Margaret, it's not what it looks like," she said, as if that could possibly undo what I had just seen. I didn't stay to hear their excuses. I walked out of the office, my engagement ring feeling like a weight on my finger. The fallout was worse than I could have imagined. When I confronted my parents about what had happened, their first reaction wasn't anger at Claire or sympathy for me. It was worry about how this would affect Claire's marriage to Alan. "Please don't say anything to Alan," my mother begged. "Think about what this could do to Claire's life. She has so much at stake. You need to be the bigger person, Margaret, my father added. These things happen. Don't make it worse than it already is. It felt like a slap in the face. Not only had my sister betrayed me in the worst possible way, but my parents were asking me to protect her, as if her happiness mattered more than my heartbreak. I wanted to scream, to tell them how deeply they had hurt me, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I walked away, cutting the conversation short before I said something I couldn't take back. The days that followed were a blur. I threw myself into my work, seeking refuge in the lab where everything felt orderly and logical. My graduate students noticed my distraction but didn't press me for details. For a few hours each day, I could lose myself in data analysis and experiments, shutting out the chaos of my personal life. But at night, the weight of it all came crashing down. The betrayal, the indifference from my parents, the realization that I had spent my entire life trying to earn their approval only to be discarded once again. It was almost too much to bear. Claire, of course, tried to justify her actions. "You're overreacting," she said in a voicemail I couldn't bring myself to listen to all the way through. "Philip and I never meant to hurt you. It just happened." She ended the message with a plea for forgiveness, reminding me that she was my only sister and that family should stick together no matter what. I deleted it without replying. Even as I tried to put the pieces of my life back together, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point. For years, I had swallowed my pain, telling myself it was easier to stay silent than to confront the truth. But now, the truth was staring me in the face, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. My parents' refusal to hold Claire accountable, their insistence that I should be the one to keep the peace, was the final straw. For the first time in my life, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before: anger. Not the quiet, simmering resentment that I had carried for years, but a deep, unrelenting fury at the injustice of it all. It was liberating in a way I hadn't expected, like shedding a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their validation or their excuses. I was done being the bigger person. From that moment on, I decided I would live my life on my own terms, free from the expectations and disappointments that had defined my relationship with my family for so long. It was time to move forward, even if it meant leaving them behind. The weeks following the betrayal were some of the hardest of my life, but they also marked the beginning of something unexpected, a sense of freedom I had never felt before. I had spent years bending over backward to fit into my family's narrative, trying to be enough, but it was clear now that nothing I did would ever matter as much as Claire's smallest triumphs. It was time to stop trying. I buried myself in work, taking on new research projects and spending long hours at the university. The lab became my refuge, a place where equations and experiments replaced the chaos in my head. It was there, amid test tubes and microscopes, that I first met Gabriel. Gabriel was an architect, brought in to design a new state-of-the-art research facility for the university. He attended one of our fundraising events, and we were seated at the same table. I didn't expect much. Most people outside of my field showed little interest in the intricacies of molecular biology, but Gabriel surprised me. When I explained my work, he listened with genuine curiosity, asking insightful questions about the intersection of science and design. "Have you ever thought about how the layout of a lab can influence creativity?" he asked. "The right space can inspire innovation just as much as the right tools." It was such an unexpected perspective that I found myself intrigued. By the end of the evening, we had exchanged contact information, and within weeks, we were collaborating on ideas for the new facility. Working with Gabriel was a revelation. He didn't just listen, he understood. He respected my expertise while offering his own unique insights, and our conversations flowed effortlessly. Unlike Philip, who had often turned our discussions into subtle competitions, Gabriel treated me as an equal. As we spent more time together, I began to notice things about him that went beyond his professional abilities. There was a kindness in his eyes, a quiet confidence that put me at ease. He had a way of making me feel seen in a way I hadn't experienced before, not even with Philip. One evening, after a particularly long day of planning sessions, Gabriel invited me to grab a coffee. We ended up talking for hours, not just about the lab but about life, our families, and the paths that had brought us to where we were. I told him about Claire, about my parents' favoritism, and about the betrayal that had left me questioning everything. Gabriel listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. You know, he said after a long pause, in architecture, we sometimes encounter buildings that look beautiful on the outside but have structural flaws that can't be fixed. No amount of renovation will make them safe. In those cases, the best thing we can do is acknowledge the problem and start over. His words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent my entire life trying to patch the cracks in my family's foundation, hoping that if I worked hard enough, if I achieved enough, things would change. But maybe Gabriel was right. Maybe it was time to let go of what couldn't be repaired and focus on building something new. That realization was both terrifying and liberating. Around the same time, I reconnected with my grandmother Eleanor. She had always been my greatest supporter, the one person in my family who saw my worth. When I told her about Gabriel, she immediately picked up on the change in my voice. "You sound lighter, Margaret," she said during one of our long phone calls. "Tell me about him." I found myself sharing everything. How he valued my work, how he made me laugh, and how he treated me with a level of respect I wasn't used to. Grandma Eleanor, now in her 90s but as sharp as ever, listened intently before offering her trademark wisdom. "Your parents have spent so much time making Claire the center of their universe that they've forgotten there are other stars in the sky," she said. "But you, my dear, have been writing your own story all along. Maybe it's time to stop letting them edit it." Her words stayed with me, echoing in my mind as Gabriel and I grew closer. For the first time, I felt like I was building a life that was truly mine, one that wasn't defined by my family's expectations or their constant comparisons. Gabriel and I began talking about the future, and though we weren't officially engaged yet, it was clear we were heading in that direction. When I shared this with my parents, their reaction was predictable. "Why didn't you tell us you were seeing someone serious?" my mother demanded, as though my life were an extension of hers that she had the right to oversee. The questions quickly turned into guilt-tripping. "We should have been the first to know," she said. "It's what parents deserve." It didn't matter that they hadn't asked about my life in months, too preoccupied with Claire's latest drama. When I mentioned that Claire wouldn't be invited to the wedding, my mother's response was a mix of shock and indignation. "But she's your sister," she said, as if that alone justified every betrayal. "Family is family." I had heard that line so many times it had lost all meaning. For once, I didn't back down. I explained calmly but firmly that Claire had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and that I deserved to celebrate my happiness without her presence overshadowing it. Gabriel, as always, was my anchor through it all. He didn't try to fix the situation or tell me how to feel. He simply supported me, standing by my side as I navigated the fallout. When I shared my frustration with him one evening, he offered another perspective that stayed with me. "Emotional boundaries are like load-bearing walls," he said. "They're not about keeping people out. They're about maintaining the integrity of the structure." That's what I was doing, I realized, protecting my own integrity. For the first time, I was putting my happiness first, and though it wasn't easy, it felt like the most important decision I had ever made. In the months that followed, I focused on my research, my future with Gabriel, and the life I was building on my own terms. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and for the first time, that felt like enough. My wedding day began with the promise of serenity. The botanical gardens, bathed in the soft morning light, felt like a sanctuary untouched by the chaos my family had so often brought into my life. Gabriel and I had meticulously planned the ceremony to reflect who we were, a small, intimate gathering with people who truly supported us. The guest list was deliberately selective. My grandmother Eleanor, my closest colleagues, Gabriel's family, and a handful of relatives who had always treated me with kindness were in attendance. My parents and Claire, predictably, were not invited. Still, I had learned not to underestimate their determination to insert themselves into my life. As I stood in the bridal suite with Grandma Eleanor and Gabriel's sister, Marie, I glanced out the window toward the entrance. My heart sank. There they were, my parents and Claire, arguing with the security team we had hired to ensure a peaceful day. Claire, in true form, was dressed in an ivory gown that could have passed for a wedding dress. My mother was sobbing, and my father was trying to reason with the guards. "They've really outdone themselves this time," I muttered, turning away from the window. Eleanor, ever the composed matriarch, placed a hand on my shoulder. "Let me handle this," she said, her tone firm but reassuring. But before she could step outside, something inside me snapped. For years, I had let my family's antics go unchallenged, swallowing my frustration and choosing silence over confrontation. Not today. I walked to the entrance in my wedding dress, my heels clicking against the stone path. The commotion quieted as I approached, and all eyes turned to me. "Margaret, how could you do this to us?" my mother cried, her face streaked with mascara. "We're your family." "You didn't even invite me," Claire added, her voice dripping with wounded indignation. "I came here to support you, to show you how much I love you." It was an Oscar-worthy performance, but I wasn't buying it. "Support me?" I said, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Is that what you call having an affair with my fiancé? Or showing up uninvited to my wedding in a white dress?" Claire opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a sleek black car pulled into the parking lot. My heart skipped a beat when I saw who stepped out. It was Alan, Claire's husband. The air grew thick with tension as Alan walked toward us, his expression a mix of hurt and determination. Claire's confident facade faltered, and for the first time, she looked genuinely nervous. "Claire," Alan said, his voice calm but sharp. "We need to talk." She glanced at me, then back at Alan, her face pale. "There's nothing to talk about," she said, trying to sound composed. But then, as if on cue, her phone rang. The sound echoed in the tense silence. She pulled it from her purse, and without thinking, answered it on speaker. "Are you still coming over later?" Philip's voice rang out, unmistakable and damning. The world seemed to stop. My parents froze, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. Alan's face hardened, his jaw tightening as he turned to Claire. "Amazing," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "All this time, and you couldn't even bother to hide it properly." My mother, predictably, turned to me as if I were somehow responsible for the unfolding disaster. "Look what you've done, Margaret," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "If you had just invited Claire properly, none of this would have happened." I stared at her, incredulous. "No, Mom," I said, my voice calm but firm. "These are Claire's choices, not mine. She chose to betray me, to disrespect my boundaries, and to continue seeing Philip while married to Alan. You've spent my entire life excusing her behavior, but not today. I won't let her ruin this for me." Alan didn't wait for further explanation. He turned and walked back to his car, leaving Claire standing there, tears streaming down her face. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents looked at me, their eyes pleading, but I held my ground. "This is my day," I said firmly, "and I won't let you take it from me." I turned and walked back toward the gardens, leaving them standing at the entrance. The remaining guests had gathered near the ceremony site, their expressions a mix of curiosity and sympathy. Gabriel met me halfway, his eyes full of concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, taking my hands in his. "I am now," I said, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. The ceremony that followed was everything I had hoped for. Gabriel's vows brought me to tears as he promised to love and respect me, to value both my mind and my heart, and to build a life together based on mutual understanding. The botanical gardens, in full bloom, felt like a perfect backdrop to our fresh start. As I looked around at the people who had supported me through the hardest moments of my life, I realized that I didn't need my parents' approval or Claire's validation to feel complete. After the ceremony, Grandma Eleanor pulled me aside. "You've been carrying a weight for so long, Margaret," she said, her voice filled with pride. "It's about time you put it down." Alan's departure and Claire's public humiliation created a ripple effect. By the time the reception ended, word had spread among the guests that Alan was filing for divorce. Claire, true to form, tried to spin the situation in her favor, but there was no salvaging her reputation this time. My parents left quietly, their faces etched with defeat. For once, I didn't feel the need to chase after them. Gabriel and I left for our honeymoon in New Zealand the next day, a trip that blended my love for science with his passion for design. We toured research facilities, hiked through breathtaking landscapes, and talked about the life we were building together. For the first time, I felt truly free from the weight of my family's expectations, free to celebrate my accomplishments without fear of overshadowing someone else, and free to be unapologetically myself. As we sipped wine on the final night of our trip, Gabriel raised his glass to mine. "To new beginnings," he said with a smile. "To a life on my own terms," I replied, clinking my glass against his. And for the first time in my life, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. My sister trapped her boyfriend to have the first grandchild, then tried to dump her baby on me, and then I. Growing up in Brookhaven was both a blessing and a curse. It was a charming town with quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and plenty of space to dream. But for me, those dreams often came second to my sister, Holly. My name is Megan, and from as far back as I can remember, Holly made sure that anything I achieved was her next target. I was the firstborn, 4 years older than Holly, and initially, I thought being an older sister would be fun. I imagined teaching her new things, being her role model, and sharing adventures. But Holly had other ideas. She wasn't content to follow. She wanted to lead, even if it meant trampling over my achievements to do so. When I was 7, my parents enrolled me in ballet classes. Holly, just 3 at the time, was utterly uninterested. She preferred building block towers or playing with her stuffed animals. But as soon as she saw the attention I got during my first recital, the tantrums began. Holly demanded ballet lessons too. My parents, eager to keep the peace, gave in. It was the first of many times they'd cater to her whims at my expense. This pattern continued into our teenage years. If I joined the school basketball team, Holly suddenly became obsessed with hoops. If I took piano lessons, Holly would practice twice as hard to outshine me at the recital. By the time I was a sophomore in high school, I had accepted that my achievements were just fodder for Holly's endless competition. Our parents didn't help. My mom, Margaret, and my dad, Peter, always seemed to cheer a little louder for Holly. I could bring home straight A's, but it wasn't until Holly started acing her classes with extra credit that they'd really celebrate. My partial scholarship to Brookhaven State University was met with a polite good job. Holly's acceptance to an Ivy League school on a full ride, though, was practically a town holiday. They shelled out thousands to support her education while I juggled part-time jobs to make ends meet. I convinced myself I didn't care. I had my own life to live, and I refused to let Holly's constant shadowing dim my goals. College was a fresh start for me. I pursued a degree in business administration, and during my sophomore year, I met Ryan. He was an engineering major with a sharp mind and a warm smile. We clicked instantly. Over late-night study sessions and long walks through campus, we became inseparable. Ryan was everything I'd ever wanted: kind, ambitious, and steady. For the first time, I felt like I was building something that Holly couldn't touch. But then, like clockwork, she found a way to insert herself. A few months after I posted a picture of Ryan and me on social media, Holly began dating his younger brother, Derek. At first, I laughed it off. Derek was a senior in high school when they started dating, and their relationship felt flimsy at best. Holly seemed more interested in the novelty of dating my boyfriend's brother than in Derek himself. Still, our parents ate it up, calling it adorable and meant to be. Meanwhile, they barely acknowledged the deep bond Ryan and I were forming. After graduation, Ryan and I moved in together in Brookhaven. Our parents were scandalized, calling it living in sin. Holly, however, got a pass when she moved in with Derek straight out of high school. It was romantic, according to my mom. Despite the favoritism, I stayed focused. Ryan and I built a life together, supporting each other through our first jobs and the struggles of young adulthood. After 6 years of dating, he proposed, and I couldn't have been happier. We planned a beautiful wedding, and for once, I thought I might get to enjoy the spotlight. But Holly had other plans. As soon as the engagement was announced, she ramped up her antics. She insisted Derek propose to her, even though he wasn't ready. When that wasn't enough, she suggested a double wedding. I flat out refused, and thankfully, Ryan backed me up. On our wedding day, Holly showed up in a white dress. She'd claimed it was cream, but even my grandmother saw through the excuse and demanded she change before the ceremony. I should have known then that Holly wouldn't stop trying to make everything about her. 2 months after the wedding, during a Sunday family dinner, Holly dropped her bombshell. She was pregnant. The announcement hit me like a punch to the gut, not because I didn't want her to have a child, but because of how calculated it felt. Derek nearly dropped his fork, his face pale and stunned. I couldn't understand why he looked so surprised, until later, when mutual friends told us the truth. Holly had stopped taking birth control without telling him. She had decided to get pregnant to secure her place as the first to have a grandchild. Our parents were thrilled, of course. My recent wedding was immediately forgotten. Every conversation revolved around Holly's pregnancy, nursery plans, baby shower themes, and college funds. Even my grandmother's antique crib, a cherished heirloom she'd gifted me, was moved to Holly's apartment because she needed it more. I tried to keep my distance, focusing on my new life with Ryan. But the more Holly leaned into her role as the center of attention, the more cracks began to show. Derek confided in Ryan during a guy's night out that he wasn't ready to be a father. He felt trapped, overwhelmed, and unsure how to navigate the situation without looking like the bad guy. Meanwhile, Holly basked in the spotlight. She threw herself lavish baby showers, posted endless updates on social media, and reveled in the attention. But behind the scenes, she was struggling. And though I didn't know it yet, her solution to those struggles would drag me right back into her orbit. Holly's pregnancy turned our family dynamic upside down. What should have been a time for Ryan and me to enjoy our first year of marriage became a whirlwind of baby talk and constant reminders of Holly's achievement. At every family gathering, the conversation revolved around her. My mom, Margaret, would gush about baby shower plans or the latest onesie she'd bought, while my dad, Peter, proudly shared updates about the college fund he'd already started for the baby. Meanwhile, Ryan and I sat quietly, our recent wedding a distant memory to everyone but us. The final blow came when my grandmother's antique crib, the one she'd specifically gifted to me, was packed up and taken to Holly's apartment. My grandmother had entrusted me with it as a symbol of her hopes for my future family. But suddenly, it was as if my place in the family narrative had been erased, replaced entirely by Holly's new role as the first to bring a baby into the fold. It wasn't just the favoritism that stung. It was the calculated way Holly had orchestrated everything. After Derek confided in Ryan about Holly's deception, how she'd stopped taking birth control without telling him, it became clear this pregnancy wasn't some spontaneous event. Holly had planned it, just like she'd planned every other move that kept her in the spotlight. Derek was visibly unraveling. On the surface, he played the supportive partner, attending appointments and putting on a brave face at family gatherings. But during his late-night conversations with Ryan, the truth came out. He wasn't ready to be a father. He wanted to focus on his fledgling IT career and felt overwhelmed by the sudden pressure to become the perfect parent. Holly, on the other hand, leaned into the role of expectant mother with all the gusto of someone preparing for a starring role. Her social media feeds were flooded with staged maternity photos and baby name polls. But behind the polished facade, the cracks were beginning to show. It started small. She'd complain about the discomforts of pregnancy, which seemed normal enough. But as her due date approached, her complaints turned into full-blown meltdowns. She'd call our mom at all hours, sobbing about how hard it was, how she wasn't sure she could do it, and how she didn't feel ready. At first, I tried to feel sympathy for her. But deep down, I knew Holly. This wasn't just fear of motherhood. It was the realization that she couldn't handle the reality of the choices she'd made. When the baby arrived, things went from bad to worse. Holly named her daughter Lily, and for a brief moment, she seemed to bask in the glow of being a new mother. She posted endless pictures of Lily's tiny hands and feet, each caption dripping with exaggerated sentimentality. But it didn't take long for her enthusiasm to fade. The first sign was how often she called our mom for help. At first, it was understandable. Late-night feedings and diaper changes are exhausting. But soon, she was calling every day, at all hours. If Margaret wasn't available, Holly would vent to me instead, unloading every frustration she had about how hard it was to be a parent. "It's just so overwhelming," she'd say, her voice quivering with self-pity. "I didn't know it would be like this." I wanted to scream. What did she expect? Parenting isn't all cuddles and Instagram likes. But I bit my tongue, offering her polite reassurances while inwardly fuming. Derek wasn't coping much better. He started staying late at work, avoiding the chaos of their tiny apartment. When he was home, he was exhausted and short-tempered, clearly drowning under the weight of responsibilities he hadn't signed up for. Things reached a boiling point during a family dinner last week. Ryan and I thought it was a routine gathering, but as soon as we arrived, I noticed something was off. My parents were unusually attentive, almost nervous. When I saw Derek's parents there too, my stomach churned. After we sat down, my mom launched into a carefully rehearsed speech about how much Holly was struggling. She painted a vivid picture of her exhaustion and mental health struggles, emphasizing how much she needed a break to sort out her life and career. At first, I thought they were just looking for more babysitting help. Then she dropped the bombshell. "We've all been talking," she said, looking pointedly at Derek's parents, "and we think it would be best if you and Ryan took Lily for a while. You're stable, you're established, and you've been married longer. Holly needs time to figure things out, and this would be a perfect solution." For a moment, I couldn't speak. It was so absurd, so audacious, that my brain refused to process it. "You're asking us to adopt her baby?" I finally managed, my voice shaking with disbelief. "Not adopt," my mom said quickly, as if the distinction made any difference. "Just take her in for now. Holly and Derek can reassess once they're in a better place. It's the best thing for everyone." Ryan's face was a mask of barely contained fury, but he let me handle it. I refused outright, explaining that we hadn't asked for this responsibility and that Holly and Derek needed to figure things out themselves. Holly, who had been quiet until then, burst into tears. "You don't understand how hard this is for me. You have everything. Your life is perfect, and you can't even help me when I'm struggling." Her words stung, but I held firm. "We didn't make this decision for you, Holly. You chose this, and now you have to deal with it. Ryan and I aren't here to clean up your mess." The room erupted into chaos. My mom accused me of being heartless. Derek's mother sobbed about how her son's life was being ruined, and Holly wailed dramatically, accusing me of punishing her. Ryan eventually stood up, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "This discussion is over," he said firmly. "If you keep pushing, we're leaving." And that's exactly what we did. As we drove home, my heart pounded with a mix of anger and sadness. I had always known my family could be manipulative, but this was a new low. I looked over at Ryan, who gave me a reassuring squeeze on the hand. "They're not dragging us into this," he said quietly. "No matter what." I nodded, silently grateful for his strength. But deep down, I knew this was far from over. Holly and my parents weren't the type to take no for an answer. I thought refusing to take Lily during that disastrous family dinner would put an end to things, but I should have known better. My family doesn't take no for an answer. What followed was a campaign of manipulation, ambushes, and outright audacity that left me questioning how far they were willing to go. It started innocently enough, or so I thought. A week after the dinner, my mom called me at work, her voice dripping with fake concern. "How are you, sweetheart? I was just thinking about you and Ryan." I didn't buy it for a second. I cut the conversation short, knowing any longer would lead to another guilt trip about Holly. Sure enough, as soon as I hung up, she texted me, "You're being so unfair to your sister. She needs you." I ignored it, thinking that would send a message. But they weren't finished. A few days later, during my lunch break, I walked to the parking lot to grab my car and get some fresh air. Out of nowhere, my mom and Holly appeared, blocking my path like two storm clouds. I froze, caught off guard by their unexpected presence. "Megan, we just need to talk." My mom started, her tone overly sweet. "Here? At my job?" I asked, glancing around nervously. A few coworkers were nearby, stealing curious glances at the unfolding scene. Holly stepped forward, her face pale and haggard. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. "Please, Megan," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm begging you. Derek and I can't do this. We need time to figure things out, and you're the only one who can help." Before I could respond, my mom chimed in, pulling a folded piece of paper from her purse. "We've even prepared an agreement," she said, as though that would somehow make this insane request reasonable. "Just 6 months. You and Ryan take Lily, and we'll reassess after that. It's temporary. I felt my blood boil. Are you serious right now? You think showing up here, cornering me like this, is going to change my answer? I told you already. This is not our responsibility. Holly started crying, big dramatic sobs that made people stop and stare. You don't understand, she wailed. I'm drowning. You're my sister. You're supposed to help me. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. Holly, you chose this. You lied to Derek. You decided to have this baby, and now you're trying to hand her off because it's harder than you expected. That's not fair to Lily, and it's not fair to me. My mom tried to play the peacemaker, her voice sickeningly condescending. Megan, you've always wanted kids. Maybe this is God's way of giving you a chance. Think of this as a blessing in disguise. Her words were so absurd that I almost laughed. A blessing? You're trying to manipulate me into cleaning up Holly's mess, and you're calling it a blessing? By now, I was shaking with anger. I'm done with this conversation, I said firmly. If you don't leave right now, I'll call security. They didn't expect that. Holly's sobbing turned into shrieks about how I was ruining her life, and my mom resorted to pleading, but I didn't back down. Eventually, they left, their dramatic exit attracting even more attention from my coworkers. I spent the rest of the day fuming, replaying the encounter over and over in my head. That night, I told Ryan everything. He wasn't surprised. He'd come to expect these kinds of stunts, but even he was shocked by the sheer nerve of showing up at my job. This is harassment, he said bluntly. We need to set boundaries. Real ones. Unfortunately, the ambushes didn't stop there. A few days later, just as we were sitting down for dinner, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find not just my parents and Holly, but Derek's parents too. It was like they'd orchestrated a united front to wear us down. Can we come in? My mom asked, her smile strained. I glanced at Ryan, who was already on edge. What do you want? I asked, not bothering to hide my irritation. They didn't waste any time. My mom launched into the same spiel about Holly's struggles, while Derek's mom chimed in about how her son's life was falling apart. They even resorted to bribes. Derek's parents offered to increase Ryan's inheritance if we took Lily, and my mom dangled the promise of a new car and a down payment for a bigger house. Ryan stepped forward, his voice cold and steady. No, this conversation is over. Leave. But they wouldn't. Holly, emboldened by the group's presence, played her final card. Fine, she snapped. If you won't help, we'll just leave Lily with you. We've already bought plane tickets to Europe. My jaw dropped. You can't be serious, I said, incredulous. Oh, I am, she retorted. You can't just abandon a baby, Megan. You'll have to step up. Her smugness was infuriating, but I refused to be intimidated. If you try that, I'll call CPS. You can't just dump your responsibilities on someone else and run away. My mom started crying, begging me not to involve the authorities. Derek's parents chimed in, pleading for us to reconsider. But Ryan and I stood firm. We made it clear that if they didn't leave, we'd call the police for trespassing. Finally, they left, but not before Holly tried one last guilt trip. I thought you wanted to be a mother, she spat. Guess I was wrong about you. Her words stung, but I didn't let it show. After they were gone, Ryan and I sat in silence for a long time, processing everything. This isn't normal, he said finally. We can't keep living like this. I nodded. We need a plan. They're not going to stop. That night, we started making changes. We decided to install a security system at the house, complete with cameras. I informed the security team at my office about the situation, asking them to be on the lookout for any unwanted visitors. Ryan and I even talked about changing our phone numbers. For the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. We were drawing a line in the sand, refusing to be dragged down by my family's dysfunction. But deep down, I knew we hadn't seen the last of them. If there's one thing my family excels at, it's pushing boundaries. After the ambush at our house, I knew we needed more than just boundaries. We needed an escape. The situation was spiraling out of control, and I didn't trust that my family would ever respect our decision. That's when I thought of my grandfather. Grandpa Walter had always been the voice of reason in our family. Unlike my parents, he didn't play favorites. and his wisdom was something I'd relied on since I was a kid. If anyone could help me figure out what to do, it was him. I decided to visit him one afternoon while my grandmother, Helen, was out with her bridge club. I didn't want to involve too many people just yet, and I needed his full attention. I picked up a lemon cake from his favorite bakery, an old tradition from when I was little, and headed to his house. When I arrived, I found him in his study, as I expected. The familiar scent of leather and old books filled the room. He looked up from his newspaper with a warm smile, but his expression quickly turned serious when he saw my face. "What's wrong, Meg?" he asked, gesturing for me to sit in the chair across from him. I didn't hold back. I poured out everything. Holly's calculated pregnancy, her inability to cope with motherhood, the ambushes at my job and home, and her insane plan to abandon Lily and flee to Europe. I told him how my parents had twisted the truth, painting me as the villain while pressuring me to clean up Holly's mess. As I spoke, I watched his expression shift from concern to anger. By the time I finished, his hands were clenched and his jaw was tight. "I knew your parents favored Holly," he said, his voice low and steady. "But this is beyond the pale. They've let her get away with everything, and now they expect you to fix it. It's shameful." He shook his head, muttering under his breath about how this wasn't how he and Grandma Helen had raised their kids. Then, without hesitation, he picked up the phone and called my grandmother. "Come home now," he told her. "We need to talk." Helen arrived 20 minutes later, looking surprised but worried. I repeated everything for her, and by the end of my story, she was just as outraged as Grandpa. "This has gone too far," she said firmly. "You and Ryan don't deserve this. And that poor baby. Holly needs to take responsibility, not pass her off like some unwanted chore." That's when Grandpa surprised me. He told me about a property he owned, a beautiful house in a quiet town about an hour away from Brookhaven. It had been rented out for years, but the tenants had recently moved out. He offered it to us, no strings attached. "You need space, Megan," he said. "Distance from all this chaos. I've been meaning to leave that house to you in my will anyway, so why wait? Take it now. Use it to start fresh." At first, I was overwhelmed by the generosity of his offer. The house was worth at least $500,000. I tried to protest, but he waved me off. "This is my way of helping," he said. "It's what family should do, real family. Let me do this for you." Grandma agreed, adding, "Sometimes, distance is the only way to deal with toxic relationships. You and Ryan deserve peace, and this house will give you that." By the next day, Grandpa had contacted his lawyer to draft the paperwork. He even added a clause to ensure the house couldn't be sold for at least 5 years, to protect us from any pressure from my parents. When I told Ryan about the offer, he was stunned. "Your grandparents are incredible," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's like they're the only ones who actually care about us in this whole mess." We spent the next few days discussing the implications of moving. The commute to work would be longer, but the chance to live in peace, away from my family's constant meddling, was worth it. We decided to accept the offer. The house needed a few minor repairs before we could move in, but Grandpa insisted on covering the costs. "I want everything to be perfect for you," he said. The moment we stepped into our new home, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The house was everything we needed, spacious, serene, and full of potential. Ryan and I immediately started making it our own. We painted the walls, added new furniture, and turned one of the spare rooms into a library for me and another into a home office for him. The backyard was my favorite part, a peaceful retreat where I could finally breathe. Despite the distance, my family didn't give up easily. My mom sent messages through relatives, accusing us of being cruel and abandoning Holly. She even tried contacting me through my work email, but thankfully, my employer respected my privacy and blocked her attempts. Holly, on the other hand, seemed to realize we were serious. When she and Derek finally understood that we wouldn't take Lily, they were forced to step up. They enrolled in parenting classes and began looking for childcare support. From what I heard through mutual acquaintances, it wasn't easy, but they were finally taking responsibility for their actions. Meanwhile, Ryan and I flourished in our new environment. We changed our phone numbers and shared them only with my grandparents and a few close friends. We installed a security system with cameras to ensure our privacy. Slowly but surely, we started rebuilding our lives. Grandpa and Grandma became our biggest supporters, visiting often and reminding us that we'd made the right choice. Grandpa even told my mom to stop contacting us unless she could respect our boundaries, a demand that led to a heated argument. But Grandpa didn't back down, and for that, I was endlessly grateful. As the weeks turned into months, the peace we found in our new home was transformative. Ryan and I started talking about our future, about the family we wanted to build, on our own terms. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. Holly and Derek's struggles were theirs to face, as they should have been all along. And while my family continued to paint me as the villain, I knew in my heart that I'd done the right thing. Sometimes, the only way to move forward is to step away. And that's exactly what we did. It has been 3 months since Ryan and I moved into the house my grandparents gifted us. The sense of peace and stability we've found here is unlike anything I've experienced before. For the first time in years, my life feels like it truly belongs to me. Not dictated by family expectations, not overshadowed by Holly's antics. The house has become our sanctuary. Ryan and I spent the first month pouring ourselves into renovations. The spare room we turned into a library is my favorite space, filled with books I've collected over the years and a cozy armchair by the window. Ryan's home office is perfect for his work, and he finally has the space to focus on some personal engineering projects. The backyard has become our retreat, a quiet place where we can unwind, plan our garden, and dream about the future. Holly and Derek, from what little I've heard, are still adjusting to parenthood. They never went to Europe, of course. Once they realized we weren't bluffing about calling CPS, they had no choice but to take responsibility for Lily. Through mutual friends, I've learned they've enrolled in parenting classes and are even seeking counseling to improve their relationship. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not enough to mend the damage they caused or the trust they broke. My parents, on the other hand, have been relentless. My mom has tried every avenue to contact me, through relatives, old friends, and even emails to my work. Each message is the same, a mix of guilt-tripping and accusations. She claims we've abandoned the family, that Holly is struggling with depression because of us, and that we're being selfish by refusing to help. My dad has been less direct, but I've heard he's been telling anyone who will listen that we've cut ties with the family when they needed us most. The thing is, I no longer feel guilty. For years, I carried the weight of trying to be the dependable one, the fixer, the daughter who always put others' needs ahead of her own. But now I see how unhealthy that dynamic was. My parents enabled Holly's behavior for so long that it became a pattern, one where I was expected to clean up her messes. Breaking free from that cycle wasn't selfish, it was necessary. My grandparents have been our rock through all of this. Grandpa Walter, in particular, has made it clear to everyone where he stands. When my mom tried to argue that Ryan and I were being unreasonable, he shut her down. Megan has done more than enough for this family, he told her. It's time you and Holly took responsibility for your own choices. It caused a huge fight, but Grandpa refused to back down. Grandma Helen even told my mom to stop contacting us until she could respect our boundaries. Knowing they're in our corner has made all the difference. Ryan's parents, too, eventually came around. They sent us a heartfelt letter apologizing for their role in the pressure campaign. They admitted they were wrong to try to manipulate us with promises of inheritance and other bribes. While I appreciated the gesture, it didn't erase the months of stress and coercion we endured. For now, we're keeping our distance. Forgiveness takes time, and one apology doesn't undo the harm caused by their actions. As for Ryan and me, we've been focused on building a life that's entirely our own. We joined a community garden in our new neighborhood, where we've started growing vegetables and herbs. It's been surprisingly therapeutic, watching something we nurtured grow and thrive. We've also started making friends in the area, people who know nothing about the chaos we left behind and see us for who we are now, not who we were back in Brookhaven. One of the most exciting changes has been our decision to adopt a dog. We've been visiting local shelters, looking for the right fit. We're leaning toward a rescue, a sweet, older dog who needs a loving home. The idea of adding a new member to our family, even a 4-legged one, fills me with hope and excitement. Looking back on everything, I feel proud of the decisions we made, even though they were painful at the time. Distance was the only way to break free from the toxic dynamics of my family, and it gave Ryan and me the space to grow closer. We've talked more about our future, about starting a family of our own someday, but only when we're ready and on our own terms. Holly and Derek may be making progress, but I'm not in a rush to rebuild a relationship with them. Trust isn't something that can be restored overnight, especially not after the stunts they pulled. It will take years, if it happens at all. Sometimes, I still think about Lily. She's innocent in all of this, a child born into chaos she didn't choose. I hope Holly and Derek continue to step up for her sake. But that's their journey, not mine. The most important lesson I've learned through all of this is that setting boundaries isn't cruel, it's necessary. By saying no to my family, I said yes to myself, to my happiness, and to the life I want to build with Ryan. For now, we're content. Our home is filled with love, laughter, and the promise of new beginnings. And while the scars of the past remain, they serve as a reminder of how far we've come. We've proven to ourselves that we can face anything together, and that's a strength no one can take away from us. Breaking free wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And as I sit in my library, the sunlight streaming through the windows, I know this is just the beginning of a brighter, better chapter.